Hey, this is Bob from INSYDIUM, and this is part 2 of our particle snow peel tutorial series. In this video, we're going to take the rig we made in part 1 and we're going to make it a bit more sophisticated, including multiple emitters and using data mapping with modifiers. So, let's get started. So here we are in Cinema 4D and we have our lollipop scene and we are going to set up multiple emitters to get our various snow effects. But before we start setting up new emitters, let's make this scene more efficient. There's no need for this bool to be constantly calculating this mesh. So what we could do is, look, let's open up our bool. We can switch the bool bit off so it's no longer minusing the spheres from the shell. And then we can make the rest of it invisible. We need the spheres active. We can't switch these off because we're using these spheres in our particle question. But by switching the bool operation off and then making it all invisible, if we hit play, we're going to get much quicker viewport playback because it isn't having to calculate that mesh calculation of the bool. So that's running much better. So now what we need to do is add a bit of variation and a bit of control over how our particles are moving. So first of all, to do this, we're going to go to our emitter. Now this emitter, if you remember, we'll bring up the settings, in the Object tab, we are emitting from the volume of our snow shell. And actually, we do want some small particles emitting from the volume, but we want the majority of the small particles being emitted from the surface of our snow shell. And this is going to help us with the clumping illusion. So let's change this one from object volume to polygon area, which will be the surface. Then we'll go to the emission, and it's on 100,000 particles, so we'll just leave it on that for now. And let's hit play. And now we've got these particles emitting from the surface of that snow shell. And you can see as soon as we do that, well, we've got lots of particles emitting from a similar position. We're getting this stepping with our wind modifier, and that's obviously not desirable. So what we're going to do is we're going to fix this stepping, but actually we're not doing the next operation to fix the stepping. We're doing the next operation to get the clumping. It'll fix some of the stepping and then we'll do something else to fix the rest of that stepping in a bit. So we're going to use color information. We're going to give these particles different colors between black and white, and we're going to use that difference in color information to make the wind affect those particles differently. So the way we'll do that is, the way we're going to give them color is we're going to use a color modifier. So let's go to our modifiers menu, we'll go to the control modifiers, and let's bring up a color modifier. Now by default, this is the color operation is set to set color immediate and the color's white. So if we hit play, all those particles are white. It doesn't matter what we put in the emitter display settings, they're just always going to be white because our modifier is taking over. So we don't want white, we want to give them these random black and white values. So we're going to use a noise, and the way we do that is, look, below the color we've got the option to use a shader. So let's pull this down, let's put in a noise, let's go forward a frame. And now you can see, look, our particles are being coloured via that noise. Now we want these particles to be coloured as if they were big chunks. So we can use, instead of using this standard noise, let's click on the thumbnail. Instead of using noise, let's use a Voronoi, which will give you that kind of cell look. So look, let's use a cell Voronoi noise. And look, yes, that's that kind of chunky look we want. Look at this. So we want them to be a little bit more contrast in this. We want the blacks to be blacker and the whites to be whiter. So let's just pull this down a bit, and we can do that by, let's just make some more room so we can see this happening to our thumbnail here. If we increase the low clip, those blacks are going to be crushed, and if we decrease the high clip, the whites will be brought up, so that's adding much more contrast to this. So now if we hit play to simulate, now look, we've created chunks of particles just by using the colour. So there's one more thing we've got to do in the colour modifier before this is going to work properly. Let's go back to the colour modifier settings. You'll see that as these particles move through 3D space, their colour is going to change because the noise remains static in 3D space. So as they blow through it, look, you can see they're changing colour because they're moving through that noise. So what we want is we want them just to be coloured on the first frame and the first frame only. So we can do that by going to the modifier object tab. Look, we have a change on birth only. And now those particles will be this colour for their entire life. Yeah, they're not changing colour as they move through the noise. They are the colour that they are. All right, that's cool. So now what we're going to be able to do is use this colour information to affect how much the wind affects them. At the moment, let's go to our wind. We have a wind strength of 150 centimetres, and that's affecting all of the particles equally. They all have that strength. However, we can go to our mapping tab inside the wind, and this is data mapping. So the mapping tab, we can add a map, and we can choose which parameter in the wind we want to map. So we want to map the wind strength, but we could, if we want, choose all of these different wind parameters, the scale, the frequency, the turbulence, or the wind. And these relate directly to, if we go back to the object tab of the wind, our wind parameters. Look, wind strength, turbulence, frequency, scale, and we can map any of these, but we just want to do the wind strength. So let's go back to the mapping tab. Yep, it's set to wind strength. Now by default, it's going to map this to the particle age. And what it's saying here is, by default, this axis, the X, is 0 frames to 90 frames. So this is 0 frames, and this is 90 frames. And then the Y-axis is the wind strength. On 0, there's 0% of the wind strength that we've set. And on 1, there's 100% of that wind strength. So what this is saying is when the particles are 0 frames old, they have no wind strength. And as they get older, the wind strength gets stronger and stronger until they get to 90 frames and beyond, and it'll be full strength. So obviously we don't want that. We want to base it on the colour. So let's change this from age to colour brightness. And now look, our range min max is set to 0 to 100% of the colour brightness. So that is our x-axis again. Here is 0% colour, so black. And here is 100% colour value, white. And then this obviously remains the wind strength. So when this is saying when the particles are black, they have 0 wind strength. And they are mid-grey, they have this much wind strength. And when they are white, they have 100% wind strength. Now, we don't want the black ones to be completely static. We still want them to have a bit of wind strength. Let's just move this knot up a bit. So that's saying that the black particles have, well, it's under half power, isn't it? Well under half power wind. And then as they get lighter, they have stronger wind strength. So let's just play that and see if it works. We should see our white particles moving faster than our darker ones. And yeah, look, you can see the black ones lagging behind. Now, this is a bit tricky to see at the moment because we've also got some movement by our turbulence modifier. We haven't done any mapping on this. This is just affecting them all equally. So let's just switch that turbulence off for now so we can just see what's happening with the wind. And now we should be able to see that the white ones are getting blown more quickly with stronger wind, and the black ones, look, aren't as fast. And we can clearly see that happening. Excellent. So that's going to help with our clumping. Very nice. But what we also want to do is we don't want these to actually blow off and then continue accelerating until they get to that wind strength speed. If we have a look at our picture viewer, we actually have a fast kind of movement and acceleration, and then they kind of calm down a bit, and that's going to help with this peeling effect. So they accelerate to a certain point, and then look, they stop accelerating. So how is that achieved? At the moment, they're just keeping that wind strength and getting faster and faster and faster. And we're not getting that kind of acceleration and that calming down. Well, we're going to do that with another map. So in our wind, let's just make our map 1 minimized. We're going to add another map. Again, we're going to map wind strength. But what we're going to do is we're going to map this one. We're going to map it to, not the age. we're going to map it to how far the particles have travelled. And what we have here it's saying wind strength is 0 when they haven't moved at all, and it's gradually going to get stronger as they've moved up to 100 centimetres. So this isn't going to work for us. We want them to have full strength straight away, and then we want that strength to tail off depending on how far they've gone. So let's just put this down to, we'll try 20 centimetres, and then we'll move this knot across. So this is basically saying for the first 10 centimetres of the particles' distance travelled, they've got full wind strength, but then it starts to tail off. And this is going to stop this continuous acceleration of these particles. Let's see. Now they're still going to move because obviously they retain that velocity. But there, look, so we're getting that immediate peel, but then we've just kind of got them under control a little bit. Now we'll do a little bit more work with this a bit later, but that's going to help with the peeling effect. Okay, that's looking good. So the final thing that we need to do with our wind, with this, we're actually going to use another wind, but with our first wind, the final thing we need to do is fix this stepping. We can see this obvious stepping of particles. So what we need to do, we've used our colour to give this distributing the wind strength, so the lighter ones are faster than the darker ones. But we need to add just a little bit more random wind strength to make sure we're not getting this perfect stepping of particles. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to create another map. So let's minimize our distance traveled map, and we're going to do another one. Before we do, we need to set something up in the emitter first. What we are going to do is we're going to give each particle a random number between 0 and 100. And that number at the moment isn't going to do anything. It's just going to be contained within the particle information. So to do that, we're going to go to the emitter. We're going to go to the extended data tab, and we're going to go to the physical data. And what we're going to do, you can see, look, we've got a user value here. Now these numbers on their own do absolutely nothing. It's just a number that each particle holds. So if I put my user value on 50 with a variation of 50, this is saying that any particle has a random number between 50 and 50 either side, so 0 and 100. So now that those particles are holding that information, again, that number does absolutely nothing. It doesn't change the sim in any way at the moment. But if we go back to our wind, to our mapping tab, we can now use that number that each particle has between 0 and 100 in our mapping. So if we go to add a map, here's our map. Again, we're going to do wind strength, and we're not going to do age. This time, we're going to use our user value. This is the user value we just put in that particle. So if we click on that, and at the moment it's saying user value, any particle that has a user value of 0 doesn't have any wind strength, and 100 has full. So this is going to be too much variation. We just want a very little bit of variation in here to break up this stepping. So just move this minimum up, and now particles with the lower end of that user value number will have slightly less wind strength than particles with the higher end of that user value number. So now if we hit play, you'll see that we have got rid of our stepping because we've added some randomness. We're still getting the clumping from the colours, that's what we want, but our stepping is no longer there, and we're starting to get this much more controlled peel of our particles that we were going for. Excellent. So that is our first bit of data mapping that we've done within the wind modifier. Now we need to apply some similar data mapping to the turbulence modifier, so we're getting a similar coherent look. So let's just get our turbulence. We'll switch it back on, and we'll go to our turbulence settings, go to the object tab. Now we're going to keep our turbulence as is, but let's have a look at what parameter it is that we want to map. Well, we want to do a similar thing to the wind, so we're going to be mapping the strength of this turbulence, and let's go to our mapping tab, add a map, So the first one, look, we need to change the parameter. By default, it's set to scale. That's not what we want. We've already identified we want to map the strength. So let's click on strength. And we don't want age over frames. That's not what we want. We want color brightness. So the darker ones of our clumpy particles won't be as affected. And we want the turbulence to affect the dark particles less. As we move up to the light particles, I'll get that full turbulence strength. So something like this might be okay. All right, so let's just press play and see how that goes. It's looking pretty cool. So arguably a little bit too strong. So what we could do with our turbulence, let's go to our mapping. We're going to actually add another map here. Let's add it. And this map is going to be a bit of variation like we did with the last one. So let's go to, we'll map the strength again to the user value. And let's add that variation again. Go back to our object tab. Let's just try reducing that volume down to say 4 and put our scale up a little bit, maybe 50, 46, 50. Hit play. All right, and that's looking pretty sweet. So now we have, if you remember, if we went to our wind modifier, our very last map, was it our last? No, our second map was this distance travelled, where when the particles travel a certain distance, they lose that wind strength. And that gave us the initial peel, which was quite quick off the lollipop, but then they slow down. The problem with that is that they slow down and then the turbulence takes over and it starts to get way too noisy and we're losing that kind of blowing direction. So we want to actually add an additional supplemental wind modifier, which is going to then just start giving them a bit more movement. So the way we're going to do that is we'll duplicate this one. So let's hold Control, drag this down. And this one, let's just rename it, and we're going to call it Wind Accelerator. And what we're going to do with our Wind Accelerator is, if we go to our mapping, there's a couple of things that we can do. We can get rid of, well, we want to change this distance travelled. And we don't want this to affect our particles at the beginning at all. We want to gradually get these particles to speed up over time once they've got past our initial blast of wind. So remember the first one, look, we stopped it at 20. So let's just say that at 30 centimetres, when they've travelled 30 centimetres up to, I don't know, let's say an arbitrary number here, maybe 110 centimetres, we want the wind strength to increase. So with this supplementary wind modifier, when the particles have moved between 0 and 30 centimetres, this will make no difference, this wind modifier. But then as they start moving more than 30 centimetres up to 110, the second wind is going to start taking effect. And it's just going to help them accelerate a bit and blow on from here so they're not clumping as much. And we could, let's just leave the rest of those maps as they are and see how we go. So we'll hit play. And this just help them move forwards a little bit and kind of keep that momentum. Yeah, that's not looking bad. Now, we arguably don't need our clumping map in our second wind because we're just trying to push them away. So let's go to our map 1, the one that was mapped to colour brightness. We can just disable this, look, just switch it off. This is in our wind accelerator. We can just have this affecting all of the particles pretty much the same, apart from we have got this little bit of variation in our third map, which we put in using that user value number in the emitter. So let's just have a look. What we want is this immediate peel in clumps. and then the turbulence takes hold, but then they start accelerating a little bit with that wind strength, which is pushing them back more in this direction. Yeah, that's looking really cool. Now we have them peeling up, moving away, and that's excellent. And remember, by this point, we're not really going to see many of these outside particles because we're going to have a very tight camera angle, but we're getting the peel pretty much right, and this one is looking good. Okay, so that is our first emitter with our surface particles pretty much sorted. Now we need to move on to create multiple emitters for the different particle snow types. So if we have again a look at our picture viewer, you can see that we have just made our surface small particles, which we can see these very small ones in the render here, but we've also got our big chunks. We've got some small particles that we want to be emitting from the volume of our shell as well to fill in some of the gaps, and then we've got our lights as well. So we've got quite a few to make. So with our existing emitter, let's just click on it, go to the basic tab, and we'll call this one emitter small surface, so we know what they are. And what we'll do with these ones is let's go to the display tab of these particles, and instead of displaying squares, let's display dots. And then in the emission tab, at the moment we've got 100,000 particles. We're going to increase this substantially, and we won't know exactly how many we're going to increase this to really until we get to the stage where we start rendering this and start instancing our little snowflakes. But it's going to probably be about 500,000, I would imagine. But let's keep them as dots for now, and that's looking pretty good. Okay, so what we can do is, for our other emitters, the beauty of our modifiers and our data mapping is that if we bring more emitters in, they'll work in exactly the same way. And if we duplicate this emitter for all our subsequent ones, the question is going to get duplicated across as well, the are they in the volume question. So we can just make loads more emitters really quickly and easily. So let's hold control, let's drag and make a copy. This one we're going to call, let's delete that down, we're going to call it small, and this one's going to be volume. So these settings are going to be virtually identical, but in the object tab of our new volume emitter, we are, instead of emitting from the polygon area, we're going to revert back to the object volume. Here it is, object volume, and we are going to emit 100,000 particles. Now let's just switch off our small surface emitter and let's just go forward a frame. So these are our volume particles, and we've selected 100,000, but you can see actually this isn't as dense, this. It doesn't look like we've got 100,000 particles there. Let's go to our display options in our emitter to get a heads up display of just how many particles we've got here. So display, look, we've got a HUD tab, let's click on that, and then let's click show HUD. And you can say, look, so we stipulated a shot of 100,000 particles to be emitted within the volume of our object, but we've only got 26,000. Why is that? Well, this is the way in which it works out whether the particle has an emission point within the volume of the object. It's what's going on under the hood, which you don't really need to know, worry about technically, but we need to know how to fix this issue because we want closer to 100,000. So if we go back to our emitter object tab, we have this max retries, and this is how many times it retries to get an emission point that is within the volume that we have stipulated. And it can take lots of tries to get every particle to get an emission point within that volume. And so this limits that to ensure we don't get kind of slowed down scenes. But this max retries isn't enough to get 100,000 emission points within that object, and so that's why we've only got 26. So look, if we bump this way up to say 200 max retries, you can keep trying and trying and trying until you get it. Now let's shoot forwards, and there, look, with that we've virtually got our 100,000 particles. So we could keep increasing it, but look, we're near to that number as we need to be. Now we've got 95,000. Okay, so now we've got that. These are our small volume particles. Let's run through that sim. And that's going to add a little bit of detail to fill out those surface particles. And then if we run both at the same time, obviously we've got double the amount of particles now, so this is going to run more slowly in our scene, but it's going to work. And of course, because our modifiers are working on all of these particles, they're all working with all of those maps automatically. All we've had to do is copy those emitter, and then we've got our volume small particles. So there we go, they're working well. So we can just go back to the beginning and we can deactivate those emitters. And now we can start looking, if we have a look at our beauty, now we can start having a look at creating the particles for these big kind of chunks of icy snow. They're really important to sell this shot. And also we obviously want these lights, which are giving it obviously a very Christmassy feel, but they bring some wonderful illumination to this translucent texture. So those are the two emitters that we need to sort out. Now let's get those sorted. So let's go into our scene. Actually, let's just get rid of this hood for now. Just activate those. Let's go to our volume display tab, hood, switch off the hood. Don't need to look at that anymore. Excellent. Right, we'll deactivate those. So now we're going to make our large chunks particles, and these are very importantly need to be in the volume of our snow shell, because they need to be kind of born within that snow shell and then kind of break out as it peels away. So we're going to duplicate our emitter small volume. Let's hold Control, left click and drag. And this one will change the name to emitter large volume. Okay, and then we'll switch that one on. So obviously these are the big chunks. We don't need anywhere near 100,000. We'll maybe start at a guess at around 1,000, but obviously when we get to kind of the render stage, when we start instancing lumps of geometry on these particles, we'll get a better idea. But of course we can make adjustments then if necessary. So because we want to see these particles, let's go to the display options, to the particle display, and let's change the editor display from dots to boxes. And now if we hit play, there are our large chunks and they're floating off. Okay. So that's working in the same way. All of the modifiers are working with those. Now, when it comes to instancing these particles, we could use the render engine to instance bits of kind of lumpy snow geometry to these particles. And they'll be given kind of random rotations. But actually, to sell this shot, we need these particles to be kind of pointing in their direction of travel. At the moment, there's no rotation at all. And we want to set that up. So it's really easy to do. All we need to do is go to this emitter large volume. Let's go to the extended data tab, general data, and we want the rotational data. Now there isn't any rotational data at the moment, so let's click this on. And the mode that we want, so they're pointing in the direction of travel, is called tangential. So let's change it from set to tangential. And now you'll see they're now rotating in the direction of travel. Excellent. So that's perfectly set up for when we get to render time to render those chunks of snow. So that one was relatively painless. All right, so now what we need to do is we need to get our lights sorted. So let's just make this one invisible, and we'll take our large volume. Let's duplicate it, hold Control, drag it down. This one will change and we'll call it, we'll keep volume as the suffix, but we'll call it lights. Now we need far fewer lights. And just so we get an idea that they are lights, and switch it on, let's change that editor display from box to, we could do circle filled, and let's give it a color. Let's give it a nice kind of glowy orange color. And in the emission tab, we don't need 1,000, maybe let's just try 35. And again, this is something that we will adjust, these specific particle numbers. We'll adjust these when it comes to the render time. Now look, here's an interesting point. These particle lights, even though I set them to be that nice orange colour, are not orange. And of course, don't forget, we have a colour modifier in this scene, which is overriding any particle emitter colour to create our simulation and to give them different effects within that wind. So we could actually just say don't be affected by the colour modifier for the lights. There's so few of them, we don't necessarily need that clumping that we get with the others. But let's just leave it as it is for now. That's fine. But when it comes to render time, obviously these will be our glowing lights. Okay, that's looking really good. So what we could do is, this is going to slow down the viewport performance because we've got an awful lot more particles in the scene now, but we can just have a look at how these particles are simulating when we have them all simulating together. So our large chunks, our lights, our particle surface, the small ones, and the small ones coming from the volume. And here we've got our animation, and we're starting to get to the detailed point. If we just hit pause, let's come down. Let's just minimize our particle system, and we could switch the bool back on, make it all visible. So now we have our snow shell with our nice kind of big lumps of particles inside of it, and as this peels away, we get our particles blowing off. And now we're kind of getting very close now to being ready to set this up for our render stage. There's still a few more things that we need to do to finish this off, but there we have created relatively quickly this X-particle system. We have a series of modifiers, all of which are using data mapping based on various attributes like colour information, distance travelled information, and then we're able to very quickly duplicate these emitters, and they are all working with those modifiers and with our inside volume question to get this look that we're going for. Now finally, we've got some more particles that we need to make. If we have a look back at our picture viewer, you can see that we've got our floating particles, but we need to create these all-important residual particles, which look like they're stuck to the surface of that sticky lollipop. And these particles are so important in selling this shot. They're arguably the most important part. So we're going to get those sorted now. Let's move that away. So let's just close up our snow particles system. We'll hold Control Alt and click on this to deactivate everything inside it. And we can also do the same for our bool and make that invisible. We just need to look at our lollipop. We could open up that lollipop. So we're going to actually paint particles onto the surface of this lollipop, which will be our residual ones. And we'll make a mesh from that and create some extra particles based on the mesh as well. So let's just get a new system in so we can get going on this. So we'll go to the INSYDIUM menu, X Particles System, and in the system, let's just rename it and call it System Painted. And in the Object tab of that system, let's change the icon just so we can differentiate it in our manager. And look, in this system here, we've got an only modifiers in same system option. I'm going to click that on, and it just means that any particles which are created from within our new system will not be affected by any modifiers from anywhere else in the scene. So that's just a safety measure, really. Okay, so our emitter, we want to use this emitter, this default emitter that's come in, as our painter. So to set that up, we don't really need to do anything. We can go to the emission tab, and in the emission mode, we can change it from rate to controlled only. And then when we link that in with our painter, we'll be able to paint the particles onto our geo. So let's find our particle painter. Then we go to the INSYDIUM menu, X Particles, and there is our XP painter. Let's bring that in. And when I do, you can see that my icon has changed, but I'm not able to paint any particles yet. And the particle painter attributes are all grayed out. And that's because we're on frame 0, and it's impossible to create particles on frame 0. So we just need to move forward a frame. And now we have all of the attributes available to us in our XP painter tool. So we have the brush radius set to 30. We'll adjust that in a moment. And we've got the preview set to the surface of the object on which you're painting. So that's going to be useful, and I'll demo that in a minute as well. And then we have the settings. The mode is set to create particles. and it's going to create them on the frame that we are in the viewport. Let's just change that to birth. So it's going to create them and we'll have them throughout the entire scene. And now it says which emitter do you want to use to create the particles. So let's drag in our emitter that we've just created. And now we can set up how many particles are emitted per click. Let's just leave it on the default 10. I might put the offset down to 0. We don't want to offset them from the surface of, we don't mind if they're intersecting the surface of our lollipop a bit. That's fine. So they have a life, these new particles will have a life of 90 frames. Let's change that to 180, which is the duration of our scene. And the radius we could maybe make, let's make the radius 2 centimeters. So now we've set all this up, if we go into the scene, we're not able to paint anything on our geometry. And that's because, well, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, you have to have selected in your object manager the object to which you want to paint particles. And you can't paint particles onto a null. So if I select this lollipop, I still can't paint the particles. I can paint the particles onto the sweep white, which is the white part of the candy. So if I select that and move my paint tool, look, as soon as it gets onto the white, we get the brush icon, and you can see that it's respecting the surface of our white candy. You can see it's angling itself round. So that's very useful, but we're not able to do the red. So what we need to do is join these two bits of geometry together so then we can paint over both. And that's easy. We'll just highlight both of them and then hit and hold Control and Alt. And we'll go INSYDIUM, X Particles, Utilities, Join Object. And that's automatically put them inside the join. And now with the join selected, I can now paint over that entire surface. Okay, so my brush is too big. Now, like the Cinema 4D sculpting tools, you can use the square brackets to increase the size or decrease it. So if I do the open square bracket, you see it's decreasing that brush size there to something like this. All right, maybe slightly bigger. Something like that. And now I can just start painting these particles into bits. I'm just kind of putting a few into the grooves, because bear in mind we're going to be meshing this, something like that. And this groove, you don't want, obviously don't want them everywhere. Maybe a nice big portion along here. And we'll just tail those off a bit, and then another bit around here maybe. So we're just going to get the basic shape of our painted particles at this point. You can of course take much longer, take as long as you like to get yours sorted out. And we can also always add to these, and usually when we get to the render stage and we start instancing bits of geometry in these particle positions, we can actually change and add more particles freely should we wish. But let's just get the basic idea down at this point. Some across here maybe. So this is a really versatile way of getting particles into your scene. And of course, if you're using a pen and a tablet, you get even more precision and even more control. Let's just move those around a bit so they're not all stopping at the same part. A bit there maybe. Okay, so let's just stop there for now. You get the general idea. So now what we're going to do is actually we're going to create a mesh from these particles. So let's go to our generators menu here, and we're going to pick an open VDB mesher. We're going to drag our emitter into the window, and we're going to get a giant mesh, because remember, in our mesher, the point radius options is multiplying the radius of our particles, and our particles are 2 centimeters, so these are 20 centimeter radius around each particle, which is just too much. Let's put it down to 1. So now it's disappeared. The reason the mesh has disappeared is that there isn't enough voxel resolution to be able to fit in these small particles with such a small point radius. As soon as we reduce the voxel size, which increases the detail, we get our mesh back. So there we go. That's going to be kind of our ice. It's looking all right. And what we could do is smooth this off a little. Let's just hit NA to hide the lines, and we can go to the filters, use filters, and look, just the default median has smoothed that off. Alternatively, you could use the Gaussian, has the most smoothing effect. If we click on Gaussian, there we have smoothed it off even more. And we could even offset this to reduce the size of this mesh a bit. If we go into this list and add an offset, now it's kind of offset that and we've got some more gaps inside. So that's looking pretty good. And the beauty of doing it this way is that now that that emitter is inside that mesher, if we go back and highlight our join with our particle painter, we're able to paint more particles and it's actually meshing it as we go. So that is pretty cool. And if you don't like what you've done, you're able to delete particles that you have created. To delete particles, if we go to the painter options, instead of create, let's put it on delete. And on delete particles, you have to have the emitter selected, which has created the particles. So let's highlight this emitter. And now if we increase that brush size, now look, we're able to delete those particles. There we go, and obviously the mesh updates. So it's a really versatile way of really art directing where you want your particles and where you want your mesh to be. So let's just leave ours like that for the time being. That's looking pretty good. I'm pleased with that. So now we have learned how to paint. We could also actually emit some particles from this new mesh that we've made, and that's going to help sell the shot too. So what we're going to do, because we want to leave our OpenVDB mesh alive, let's just make a copy of it. So we'll select it, we'll hold Control, drag it down. Now we want to keep this as is in case we want to paint some more particles, but by making a copy, we can then take that, press C to make it editable, and now this is an editable polygon object. We'll switch the original mesher off. We can come back to it should we wish. But now we have this mesh. So let's say we want to emit some particles from this mesh now. Well, let's do that. Look, instead of selecting new emitters and setting them up, what we can do, let's just copy some emitters from our snow particles system. So let's open this up. And what do we want? Well, we want the large volume particles. Let's click on that one, hold Control, drag it up, and we'll put it in our emitters folder in our new system. And let's also get the small surface ones, and let's drag those up and put it in our system. Okay, that's looking good. Let's just switch all that off for now. So let's activate those. Now we need to do a couple of things to set these up, because at the moment they're not referencing the right object. They're not going to be emitted from our new mesher here. So with our emitter small, let's just see its settings, and in the object tab, instead of the object being the snow shell, we want to emit from our new painted particles. And let's have a look. In the emission, we probably don't need 100,000 because it's a much smaller surface area than was the whole candy. Let's put it on 50,000. And just so we can see these clearly, let's go to the display and change it from dots to squares. And one last thing we should do here, look, let's make sure that we're not using, do you remember we put a particle question to see when we're going to activate those modifiers for these particles. So let's just take that inside volume question, because we don't need it in these are static particles. Let's just delete that out so it's nowhere near our system. All right. And let's go to our emitter large. We'll do the same thing as we're in that questions tab. Let's delete that question. We don't need it in our static particles. Let's go to the display, and they're set as boxes. We'll leave it at boxes for now. And in the object, we need to remove the snow shell and put our mesher. And then let's have a look at the emission. We probably don't need 1,000. Maybe let's try 200 of these ones. All right, so then let's go forward a frame. And there you can see that we have our particles. The larger ones are a little bit tricky to see. Let's actually change those. In the box, let's make it a box build. And we'll just kind of make it a greyish colour, something like that. Okay. There we go. So there are our larger ones. So we've got our mesh, we've got our snow particles, we've got our large particles, and we can carry on painting should we wish. And we can do that at render time. We can get this set up and make sure that we have all these positioned in exactly the places that we want. So now that we've done that, let's just minimize this system. What we could do, let's activate everything. So we'll activate our XP snow particles system. We'll activate our bool and make it visible. All right, let's hit ND. So there's our object. And if we hit play, now obviously we've got hundreds of thousands of particles in here now, and we've got a bool cutting out all of this geometry live. So the playback speed isn't real time, but we're able to watch through this, and we're getting the look that we want. We're getting our geometry animation. We're getting our particles peeling away. We've got our snow particles, our chunk particles, our light particles, and then behind we are left with our residual big chunks. We're left with our mesh, which we can mesh with the same material as our big chunks, and we've got our small surface particles and even our painted particles should we require them. So there we have our rig set up relatively quickly. We have got this really nice peel effect, and so that is the end of this stage of the tutorial. In the next video, we'll be taking this rig and we'll be setting up how to render it in Cycles 4D. There's lots to do. There's obviously the materials, there's the lighting. We also need to create the geometry, which we're going to instance as part of these large chunks and the lights. And you'll see at render time, it really is the time when it all comes together to sell the illusion of this snow peel shot.